right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Christy Walkuski. I'm the director of the Brain Center here at BW. Julie Robinson is also here from the Brain Center. You'll get to hear a bit from her at the conclusion of tonight's event. Thank you so much. I see some familiar names and faces in the participant list tonight from those of you who logged in for our first event in the series last week. Dr. James Garrison shared a powerful talk based on his work, Black Bodies That Matter. If you were not able to join the event, I encourage you to check out the recording of the session. It's available at our event website, which is www.bw.edu/civic. Dr. Garrison has also provided a great list of additional resources that you can access there. I think we've all been on a lot of virtual events and meetings currently, but just a little bit of event etiquette to remind everyone. We're all going to remain muted during Dr. Sutton's presentation. We will have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free at any point to submit your questions in the chat box. We may not be able to address all of them in our 1 hour time frame, but I will certainly make sure that Dr. Sutton gets a copy of all those questions, and we can figure out if there's another platform or another way we want to answer those or address those. This session will also be recorded and shared via our Brain Center YouTube channel, and also post on the event page that I shared earlier. Just a quick intro to the Civic LEAD Series, which is new this summer. As we begin this series, we recognize that the work towards racial equity and racial justice is very complicated, but really our intentions for this series were fairly simple. We wanted to start a campus conversation, we wanted to provide resources, and begin to help our community to connect and build relationships from a very preliminary shared space of understanding. We recognize that these conversations alone are not the solution, but we hope that they're a place to start from. I also want to be clear that this series is by no means comprehensive, either in academic perspective or in lived experience, but we again hope that this is a platform for sharing and learning that we can continue to build on in the upcoming year. I would also say along those lines, if you have a story to share or a topic that you'd like to engage the BW community in discussion about, please reach out to Julie and I. We currently have a great lineup of faculty presenters this summer, but we really hope to expand to include student voices and community partner voices in the future. Finally, just a reminder that this event is rooted in the expectations established by BW's community standards of conduct. So by that, we mean we expect that this is a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. All right, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Tom Sutton. I am so appreciative of your time. I know you have a lot going on this summer. For those of you who may not know, Dr. Sutton is a professor of political science, director of the BW Community Research Institute, and coordinator of the Africana Studies minor here at BW. Tom's teaching includes courses in U.S. politics and public policy, urban politics, African politics, and Africana Studies. His experience includes working with at-risk youth in Cleveland, spending a summer as a Fulbright scholar teaching and conducting research in Ghana, and providing political analysis for WEWS Newschannel 5 and a variety of other local and national media outlets. I always, every now and then I turn on the radio, I'm like, oh, it's Tom. So you never know where you're going to see him. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Kent State and a BA in political and social thought from the University of Virginia. You know, it's interesting, as we were working on this kind of interdisciplinary lens on racism and racial justice, when we think about two topics that we are taught in our culture not to talk about, politics and race are certainly two of those topics. And so glad we can open up this conversation tonight, and I appreciate Tom sharing your perspectives and your expertise on this area. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom. You can go ahead and share your slides whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you and Julie and the students who have helped to put together the Civic LEAD Series. It's an honor and a privilege to be part of this. And I do want to emphasize the conversation part of this that I hope we will engage in tonight, and very much emphasize what Christy said, that this is really, if you will, a bit like the rock skipping across the lake. We're going to touch several points. I cover a lot of this material in half of a semester-long course on Africana Studies, and that's the rock hitting a few more places than usual, but still, there's so much depth and so much of importance that we probably won't get to tonight. But really, what I hope is that this will spur discussion and provide some context for where we are today, particularly in the wake of the demonstrations of the last few months, and hopefully that those really are serving as a turning point for awareness and for action. And so with that, I will try to share my slides and see where that goes. All right, it's a good day. I got a slide up. Here we go. So, the politics of race, whites, blacks, and the struggle for voice, power, and change. While this is about race, we are focusing tonight specifically on blacks, African Americans. You will probably note and see that there are many similarities in terms of some of the statistical data related to disparities in income, household wealth, educational attainment, etc., between blacks and Hispanics, and also Native Americans. But for tonight's purposes, really the focus is on the specific experience and situation of blacks. So to take the title, I think it's important to start with definitions of what we mean by politics and race. Now, these are composite definitions that I have put together. They're not quoted from anyone, though you'll see a lot of similarities probably with some of the material that you may have encountered before. Starting with politics, conventionally speaking, politics, the peaceful processes, people, and institutions involved in making decisions about governance. We've heard the phrase politics is personal. Certainly it's gotten very personal in the last several years, perhaps decades. But really this is the politics not of the workplace or the marketplace, but specifically the politics of governance. The key element to keep in mind is that politics is about gaining power to influence decision-making. The institutional elements of U.S. politics, so here's your Government 101 course in about 2 minutes. Constitutional democracy, that is what the United States has as its form of government. We select office holders democratically, though the ways in which that are done are flawed and always subject to continuous and improvement, we hope. Majority rule. Majority rule makes great sense in a democratic system, but what if you are not the majority? You are a citizen, but perhaps part of a group considered a minority. Right there, you set up one potential source of conflict and marginalization. The defined and implicit powers of government. What explicitly is government supposed to do, and what does government sometimes wind up doing, whether it has that explicit power or not. Federalism may sound boring, but it is critically important to understand in the context of race and politics, because the ability of states to essentially ignore the federal government or for the federal government to give states powers that they then abused is a very core part of the story of the black experience of politics. It's their exclusion from politics really until really the last 50 or 60 years. The protection of rights and liberties. This specifically applies to those that are in the minority. We all enjoy the protection of rights and liberties under the Bill of Rights and under subsequent court decisions, but understanding that often it is the minority, either of voice, of religion, of race, of ethnicity, that needs that protection, because often when there's a disagreement with the majority will then try to put limits on those rights and liberties of the smaller group. When the political process fails, and that means the failure of voting, of representation, of legislation, of rulemaking, of agency action, people act through public demonstration. And they do so with the protected rights under the First Amendment of speech, assembly, and petitioning the government. I can't emphasize the importance of the historical moment that we are living in now with the demonstrations that have taken place in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and in subsequent Rayshard Brooks. This really is an unprecedented time. The comparisons even to the civil rights movement may fall a bit short. So for those of you who wanted to live in interesting times, consider yourself there. Defining race. Race in the United States is a socially constructed definition of a group of people by social powers, usually determined by elements such as physical features predominantly, but also geographic origin and or cultural attributes. Those can be language, religion, shared origin stories from nations of origin before coming here as immigrants, and of course the specific race that was here when others arrived, Native Americans. In the U.S., race definitions are codified by the U.S. Census and are chosen by the census takers. So if you're taking the census as of 2000, you can now choose your own racial categories. In older iterations of the census, it was census takers who came house to house to visit, or that you might have gotten a call survey, and often it was the person administering the census who chose your race for you. This year, there are 6 categories for the census that are racial: white, black, or African American, Asian, American Indian and Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, or some other race. Hispanic is included as an ethnicity, not a race, though until the 1980s, 90s, Hispanic was considered a race, Mexican in particular. So now that's why you get the question, white non-Hispanic, white Hispanic, or Latino, Latina. The multiple choice categories I mentioned has been around since 2000, where you can check more than one box, and for many people that is a more accurate representation. 1890 census was the first census in which the term race was used, and you can see an interesting collection, to say the least: white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon. So you had 4 categories that today we would refer to simply as black or African American: Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. This is because of the migration patterns that were happening in the late 19th century, and these were the groups categorized as races that the United States government decided should be counted as separate groups. The first census of 1790 did not have racial categories. Instead, the count was rather simple: free white males, free white females, other free persons, and of course, slaves. And you can see to the right, and maybe take a look at it later when you get a chance. This is an example from the 1930 census that is instructions for the census takers. You see Negroes, Indians. What I find interesting is that under item 151, there is also a category, I believe it is, no, I'm sorry, in the 149, the very top one, HIM for Hindu. So Hindu was actually counted. Today we would say that's India, from the South Asian country of India. So now the question is, how does race intersect with politics? There are many places, many layers of our society in which we see these intersections. Group identities and stereotypes, both positive and negative. Group interests, needs, and goals. Power dynamics, which groups control the power centers of the economy, of politics, of state and local institutions, of education. There's political processes, the political parties that choose candidates who then run for office and fund those candidacies. Interest groups, a wide variety, ranging from public interest groups that advocate for the environment, for education, for social welfare, business groups, labor groups, there are thousands. Critically, campaign money. You can't run for office and win for free. Often you need millions to run for offices such as Congress, the Senate, and the presidency. Elected offices, obviously, are a critical part of the political process, and leadership roles. Leadership roles ranging from elected officials, business leaders, community leaders, and advocates, activists. Dr. Martin Luther King never held a formal office in public office. He was a pastor, a preacher, and a national leader in the civil rights movement. Economic power, critically important. Corporations, business interest groups, unions, and individual wealth. And then finally, the most fundamental intersection is socio-political values, constitutional authority, liberty and freedom, which we're having big debate about right now regarding the COVID crisis, the protection of rights and liberties, equity of opportunity and treatment, rights of property and commerce, are all the values, and then more beyond that, that we typically see this intersection taking place, and where questions arise as to whether people are getting their rights and liberties protected, etc. I put justice with question marks because justice is not a constant. It is in some ways socially constructed. It relies on the law, which relies on the lawmakers who are then elected by the people. And that, as we know, is fraught when it comes to true representation of the people, particularly to whom the systems of justice are applied. So when we look at the situation of Black Americans today, we see that disparities and segregation do persist. Roughly 1/3 of Blacks live in 21 what are called hyper-segregated cities, That's down from 40 such cities in 1970, so there has been progress. Cleveland, by the way, ranks in the top 5. Hypersegregation is defined as cities with black neighborhoods that are largely some 85, 90% plus African American. Often that is accompanied by also segregated schools that are neighborhood schools, and so the residents, kids that go to those schools, by definition then, are black or white. Cleveland's segregation historically has been blacks on the east side of the city and whites on the west side. We see more integration on the west side, though on the east side it is predominantly black. The city itself is about 49–50% African American. 80% of blacks and Hispanic students attend K through 12 schools that are at least 50% students of color. Our schools today are more segregated in some ways than they were at the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. School desegregation orders in 2012, approximately 1,200 districts across the country were under some form of court order to desegregate. When it comes to disparities, we look at the level of degrees earned post-high school. Bachelor's and advanced degrees, whites are 32% of those degrees, blacks at 19%. For voter registration, this is anyone who's eligible to vote. Whites are at 71% registered, blacks at 63.7%. For healthcare, this is a good indicator. If you have some kind of healthcare coverage, the likelihood is that you are at least able to access healthcare to then take care of health problems, take care of chronic conditions, and be less sick, less at risk than those without health care. In 2010, 19.9% of blacks were without health care of any kind. That dropped to 13.1% in 2018 due to the Affordable Care Act. For whites, 11.5% in 2010, 7.5% in 2018. So I'm not necessarily advocating for or against the Affordable Care Act, but the facts are clear that the expansion of affordable care through that act did result in a reduction in the uninsured. Now remember, non-elderly are specifically those who are not qualified for Medicare. All are qualified for Medicare at the age of 65. To the right, you see the imprisonment rates. This is a topic of frequent discussion, and you see the disparities in the lines. This is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics from the Department of Justice. If we look from 2006 to 2018, the good news is that we see a decline in imprisonment rates. This is per 100,000 population, 2,261 blacks versus 324 whites per 100,000. In 2006, that's dropped to 1,501 blacks, 268 whites, but still you see the disparities are large and Hispanics there in between. This again is an indicator of police enforcement, what's being enforced. Drug laws often have a lot to do with who gets imprisoned and who doesn't. This campaign, presidential campaign, we've seen a lot of questions raised about 1990s get tough on crime laws, the 3 strikes law, et cetera, that contributed to these disparities in incarceration rate. So why the persistent inequities? This is your literally 1 to 2 minutes of history, because we can't forget the history if we're going to look at where we are today. Starting with the Jim Crow laws that really went into effect at the end of Reconstruction, the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896 that codified separate but equal. You'll learn more from that from my colleague, Dr. Palmer, who will be also doing a presentation later this summer on Constitution and race, constitutional cases. Black codes. So the North, you're not exempt from this issue. Black codes of Ohio and many other states basically stipulated a version of Jim Crow. When we first became a state, to enter this state and live here as an African American, you had to post a $500 bond. And there's evidence that the Jim Crow laws were modeled in part on the black codes of Ohio. Of course, terrorism. If you can't force people through the law and through social practice to segregate, a little bit of terrorism goes a long way. And the KKK is well known for that. We've seen the terrible anniversaries of the Tulsa massacre that happened of Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest areas in Black America at that time in 1919. The Rosewood attacks in Florida, many other neighborhoods. We often think of the worst of segregation being in that late 19th century period. But when it comes to the terrorism and the re-entrenchment of this segregation, the 19-teens and 20s were probably a more dangerous time for blacks than even the late 19th century. Deed covenants. Now we get into why those wealth disparities existed and exist today, where properties often had deed restrictions that could not be sold to, at one point, Catholics, Jews, blacks. This went straight through. There are probably properties still today here in Cleveland and in many others that have those deed covenants. So if you own an old house like I do, 1906, you might want to check the original deed because that covenant may still be there. It's null and void, but it may still be in the paperwork. The New Deal. We often praise the New Deal as having brought great benefits to those suffering from the Depression, but it was also very discriminatory. Very good documentation of the discrimination in the building of public housing, which started at that time, the administering of welfare, the beginnings of Social Security benefits, all because in many of these programs, states were left to administer these programs and determine what could be done with the federal money and the federal programs. We in Cleveland are proud to say that we were among the first to get public housing, the Outhwaite and Cedar estates being the first public housing projects built here in Cleveland. But you should know that the Cedar estates originally were supposed to be integrated, and there was local opposition to that, and so the federal government agreed to build a second housing project, Outhwaite, and Cedar was for black residents and Outhwaite was for the white residents. And so from the very beginning, public housing was segregated. The GI Bill passed after World War II to provide benefits to returning veterans, deliberately excluded at the state and local level GIs who were black from receiving benefits, in particular from qualifying for FHA guaranteed mortgages, which were the main source of the boom in housing that led to housing ownership going from 30% before World War II to about 60% by 1960. But most blacks were not able to buy because they couldn't get a mortgage because it didn't have FHA backing, and that was due to deliberate, overt writing into the rules of FHA the exclusion of people who were black. And this is what we call redlining, where red lines were drawn on maps of neighborhoods, and those that were in the black neighborhoods were kept there. Real estate agents were told only to sell blacks homes if they bought them at all, often instead it was rental, in those neighborhoods, and to steer whites to the white neighborhoods and keep them separate. The interstate highway system was another source of segregation because it was often built through cities to use that, as well as rail lines, to divide black and white neighborhoods. And in Cleveland, the Interbelt literally divides east and west side. Interstate 90 goes through some of the poorest neighborhoods, particularly on the west side. 480 used to be referred to when it was built in the 1970s and 80s by George Forbes, who was a black councilman, became head of the city council in Cleveland, as the line of segregation, segregating what were then the white suburbs to the south from Cleveland to the north. School desegregation was a powerful step forward in addressing racial disparity, but it also led to white flight because no law required school districts to serve students from other districts, and whites often and black middle class left the cities, the inner cities, for the suburbs. Just as blacks are getting a toehold economically out of migration, coming to the north for industrial jobs that paid better and with less threat of terrorism from KKK, you had deindustrialization. So labor unions began to lose power. Unions often resisted admitting blacks, eventually did, the auto industry being a good example of that. But with deindustrialization, just as black workers were beginning to climb that ladder economically, socially, and educationally, the ladder was taken away from them and many others with the shipping of jobs overseas through the auto industry, steel, etc. And then finally, the criminalization of black males through the war on drugs, the 3 strikes rules that were passed in the 1990s. After your 3rd felony conviction, you went to prison for life. Police use of force abuse, which is certainly an issue that we're dealing with today, but please be clear, an issue that has been at the root of police treatment of blacks going way back, going all the way back really to the Jim Crow era. People look at the riots that took place in the 1960s, and here in Cleveland, the riots that happened in Huff in 1965, and in Glenville in 1967. In both cases, those were incidents that were provoked by police undue use of power and force that then erupted into violence across these neighborhoods. Black progress is often overlooked, but to be recognized, because in spite of all of these obstacles, we saw amazing progress from Reconstruction to the present. Education, land ownership, voting, and holding office during that brief 12-year period of Reconstruction took place. Literacy among blacks in the South, remember, it was illegal to be literate as a slave, rose to about 70% by the end of Reconstruction. It was amazing how fast that happened. Brief moments of land ownership that then were ended when acres and a mule was instituted and then revoked. A few years later, it was a brief period of about 5 years, and that land was returned to white landowners. Blacks then became sharecroppers and tenant farmers. We had 17 members of the Congress who were black at that time. I have another slide that we'll look at in a moment that gets into that as well. The rise of the black middle class and intellectuals, black banks, insurance, entrepreneurs, the founding of the NAACP in 1909 by Du Bois and his colleagues, battle heroism from the Civil War to World War I, the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, and of course the Great Migration, 7 million blacks moving from south to northern cities for better jobs and to escape the terror that they faced if any of them sought better wages from the farm owners, where there were efforts to unionize. The great book, Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Distant Suns, documents this very clearly. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Movement that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the EEOC, and the Civil Rights Commission. Julie, you are raising your hand. Question or comment? Julie?
And Julie, you can go ahead and type in the chat box. I can, if you have a comment or a question.
All right. And I'll just complete this slide, and I see I'm already starting to hit my time limit, so we're going to have to we're going to pass through this a little more quickly to get to current issues. School desegregation, I've mentioned, gaining political office. Carl Stokes, the first black mayor of a major American city, Cleveland, in 1967, elected. Lewis Stokes, his brother, first African-American elected to Congress from the state of Ohio, served until 1999. Affirmative action, which led to the breaking down of the glass ceilings, or the racial ceilings and walls for employment in many areas and for education. And of course, many stories of breaking the barriers in sports, entertainment, and business. In Congress, we've had 162 black members of Congress since 1870, 17 who served until 1887. From 1887 to 1901, that dropped to 5. And from 1901 to 1929, no blacks were elected to Congress. So really there we are in the depths of that period in which a lot of progress was pushed back by whites who did not want to see blacks continue to progress politically or economically. 1929 to 1970, we see 13 blacks serve in Congress, all from northern states. I will skip over those names and go to 1970 to 2009. And of course, this coincides with, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, 127 blacks serving in Congress. Currently, there are 3 in the Senate, 54 in the House. Some notable names: Barbara Jordan of Texas. Above her, Shirley Chisholm, also she's the first African-American woman in Congress, and the run for president in 1972 on the for the Democratic nomination. Senator Carol Moseley Braun, first black female of the Senate, and of course, the one we know probably better than all, Senator Barack Obama, who later becomes the first black president. Today's issues, a variety of issues, and this is where I hope we'll get into discussion. K through 12 education adequacy and equity, which persists as an issue largely because of the structural inequities of property taxes, where cities with low property values generate low property tax revenue, Suburbs, and this is changing, some suburbs are becoming a bit like cities in dealing with lower property values. But wealthy suburbs generate high property taxes, and that helps to fund better schools. The wealth and wage gap. Roland Fryer, African-American Harvard economist, has documented this and the reasons for it. Socioeconomic discrimination, either in jobs and promotions. Implicit bias. This is something we're becoming much more aware of, that first impression. When you see someone who is black, or for some Latino, or whoever it happens to be, the psychology of this, and my colleague Stephanie Richmond can speak a lot more about this and will be in her presentation. Police use of force, of course, the one that's been most front and center in the news lately. Racial inequities in law enforcement. Fryer, I mentioned, issued a paper 2 years ago using data from 4 different police departments and a police contact survey that showed that blacks and Hispanics are 50% more likely to have their police put their hands on them in some way, 21% more likely than whites to have a policeman draw a weapon on them. Even that documentation we see is clear. Public safety in urban neighborhoods. Defund the police may be a popular battle cry these days coming out of the demonstrations, but at the same time you have urban neighborhoods, including in Cleveland, where law enforcement is desperately needed to deal with urban violence and crime, particularly when it comes to gang violence, just random gun violence. We had 40 people who were shot and 7 who were killed in Cleveland just over the July 4th weekend. So this is an endemic problem that does require some kind of law enforcement. Public safety, access to health care, we've talked about. Full consideration for professional advancement and equal treatment in the STEM fields, medicine, law, business, entrepreneurship, and many other areas. Access to affordable, quality higher education and degree completion. It's not enough to get in, you also need to complete the degree. Great disparities there. And then the very important but controversial subject of reparations. Charles Ogletree from Harvard Law School, Nicole Hannah-Jones, reporter from the New York Times, have raised this question. It's back again, particularly in the light of what we've been dealing with over the last few months. So, politics since 2016. Where are we today? Donald Trump was elected narrowly by the 87,000 vote difference across the 3 states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He ran a campaign that fed off fear, frustration, reality show stardom, and this idea that we could bring America back to where it was. And it worked by the narrowest of margins in those 3 states. Since his election, we've seen the rise of the reemergence of white supremacist groups. Of course, the violence in Charlottesville, the shootings at the Temple in Pittsburgh. The FBI now defines the biggest terrorist threat in the United States to be from right-wing groups. Documented by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 893 terrorist incidents in the U.S. since 2014, 57% by right-wing groups, 25% by left-wing groups. Since then, we've seen, of course, economic growth, wage gains, tax cuts, trade tariffs, the efforts to gut the ACA, and, of course, COVID cut off all of that. Housing. The House gained a Democratic majority in voices of progressives in 2018. The Squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and company. James Clyburn. Now, this is where having a position in leadership makes a difference to the nation. James Clyburn, one of the senior members of the House delegation, the Democratic delegation, many credit as being the one who, with his endorsement of Joe Biden a week before the South Carolina primary, promoted a high black turnout that voted largely for Joe Biden and started the dominoes falling to his eventually becoming the presumed nominee for the Democratic Party. So if ever someone made a difference, at least at this point in the election, James Clyburn gets that credit. The $2 trillion in crisis funding for COVID-19, skyrocketing unemployment and sudden GDP plunge, which raises great questions about, well, we had $2 trillion to throw at the nation's economy and the unemployed due to the COVID-19 crisis. Well, where's all that money for things like equity in schools, for higher education funding, for health care, et cetera? And then finally, of course, what I've mentioned several times, and we can talk about the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many, many others, which really became this tipping point towards national awareness of police killings, black fears, and systemic racism. And so, now comes the time for discussion and questions. I have a couple of starter questions that you can look at and respond to. You may have your own. And at this point, I will go to the chat section. Just as a reference, if you'd like to look at it, type's not very big. Sorry about that. Maybe I can increase that. Let's see. There's a way to make this bigger, I think. Anyway, 8 lessons for talking about race, racism, and social justice. You can take a look at that when you get a chance. So let's go to questions. Good. You can read. I'm glad. Here we go. All right. So hit me with your best shot. Okay, so Barb's asking, what do you think Joe Biden needs to do to mobilize black voters? That's a great question. And mobilizing black voters is going to be critical in many of these swing states, the 3 that I mentioned, Ohio, of course, many others. I would suggest that to mobilize black voters, he has done a pretty good job of tying himself to the legacy of Barack Obama as president, since they worked together in that work for 8 years. But he needs to do more than that. I think what he really needs to do is show very clearly a commitment to programs that he would try to institute as president that will specifically help blacks. We have a terrible paradox in our politics of this country. Barack Obama, in some ways, had to run as a non-black candidate when it came to the issues in order to attract the majority support of whites that are critical to getting anybody elected. Blacks are 13% of the population. And that number alone tells you that you can't run as just the candidate for a minority group. And so with that being the case, Barack Obama tended to be a lot more moderate on some of these issues, particularly issues dealing with education. He focused on health care with the Affordable Care Act. Let's also remember he was trying to salvage the country out of the Great Recession. Joe Biden has the opportunity, I think, to take things much further. However, he's going to be saddled also with emerging out of this COVID crisis, the economy crisis that comes with it, and we now have another $3 trillion in deficits added to what is now a $26 trillion debt, and he, like Democrats before him, is going to be saddled with that as a constraint when it comes to spending. Kiara is asking, what classes do I teach at BW? I teach classes in urban politics and policy, intro to American government, intro to Africana Studies, which this semester is going to be taught by my good friend and colleague, Professor May, over in the history department. I highly encourage people to take it with him. And I also occasionally teach the dreaded research methods, which is a very good course, but not easy for many. If race is a construction, then are facts around race constructed? Great question. Is there any restriction to what counts as true or false with regards to race? This is a great question because if you're a strict post-structuralist, everything is constructed, but I would suggest that the facts of laws passed to discriminate are specific to the social constructions of race that those laws are responding to. We have evidence from Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, who documents very clearly the history of redlining and segregation and discrimination when it comes to property and mortgages and everything that really are the source of wealth for most families, and why the wealth today of an average white family, the median white family has a wealth of $171,000. The median black family has a wealth of $17,000. And the difference is in home ownership and the wealth that is tied to home ownership. So I think in that case, James, those are the facts on the ground. The question is really the social construction that I think we see changing even before us, is how whites see themselves in relation to blacks as much as it is how whites construct blacks. And I think we're seeing both changing at the same time. I am astounded in a happy way at the mainstream use of the terms systemic racism, white privilege, and even institutionalized racism. These are terms that were often used by those of us that teach about this, by people on the ground, but you didn't hear this sort of thing in mainstream media and from particularly from whites. And in these demonstrations, we've seen this. So I think there we're seeing a rapid social change, and using the term construction, perhaps a changing of that construction of what race means. Maddie, do you think that moving toward political extremism on both sides contributes to an avoidance of the actual social issues at hand, turning them into political struggles for power instead of focusing on social aspects, or are political aspects and social aspects inevitably intertwined? I'll say yes to both. Extremism and polarization has been a hallmark of our politics since the 1980s, I would suggest, and 90s. Newt Gingrich often gets credit for having contributed to that polarization with the Contract for America 1994 campaign that brought the House a Republican majority for the first time since 1954. And he found that the divide works better than the unite. And it's an old tactic in politics. Divided, we win. United means compromise. And we as a country for a while, particularly in the 80s, said that we didn't want compromise. We wanted people to stand on principle. And politicians on both sides took that to mean we have to be pure of principle. The primary process contributed to the polarization because it was the activists and parties that then went further to the right and further to the left, which leaves us with the kinds of office holders and candidates that we see today. Joe Biden has moved more to the left as a result of pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Donald Trump really was not a classic conservative when he ran. He's really more of a demagogue populist, but he'll grab onto those extremist positions if he thinks it will advance his standing with his constituent groups. And clearly he became president as someone who never ran before, so it worked for him. I would also suggest that one of the hard questions that this involves is that we are getting wrapped up in a lot of polarization issues and not paying attention to the deeper issues that are harder to solve, take longer, and will cost more. And those issues largely are the kinds of issues that we've just talked about. Issues involving reform of police. There are 17,985 police agencies across the country from federal to local, 3,000 of which are sheriff's departments. Trying to reform across the board those agencies is a Herculean task. But clearly they also reflect the culture, and to use that term that James raised, the racial construction of how we see each other. And until we start to work at that level, but that's work that's going to take time, and it's going to take money, a lot more money than we're spending now. Education's another example of that. But we were able to drop $3 trillion in the course of a month on trying to rescue us out of the COVID crisis and economy. I would suggest perhaps maybe there's more money where that came from, or more debt, to address these issues as well. Megan, since Barb brought up voters, I'd like to know what organizations or individuals at BW might be doing to get our students to register to vote and show up at the polls. Are there areas where we can encourage our students to vote as one step toward changing policies? Megan, I turn to our activist, Julie Robinson, has been very involved in the Brain Center on organizing students and getting student groups organized. Julie, you want to say a word about that?
Absolutely. Trying to share my video here. So there is a team of students called Jackets Engaged that does nonpartisan political engagement. They're actively registering students. It's a bit more challenging with COVID-19, but they have some great ideas for getting folks interested in voting. They do education. They're thinking of doing a podcast or a video cast to help students understand how to get past barriers to voting. And BW has committed to the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge, which is a national effort among colleges and universities to increase democratic engagement. And with that, we've created an action plan that outlines the various efforts that BW and Jackets Engaged will be partaking in this next year. And if I can get the link, I'll put it in the chat box for that action plan.
All right, thanks, Julie. Appreciate it. Vicky asking, what do we? These acronyms, I'm afraid I don't necessarily recognize. PWI. Can you help me out, Vicky? And BIPOC. I think that's BI persons of color, but I'm not sure what
PWI
that's really.
is predominantly white institutions, referring
Thank
to.
you.
Yep. Oh, there we go. Sarah typed it in there.
Okay.
And yeah, the Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Great. So great question, and this is a question that I've discussed with students in classes, but in particular the Introduction to Africana Studies class, which, at least in my experience, is one of the few places where I have a class where students of color are 50% or more of the class. And so, and I encourage these kinds of discussions. I start the first day, explaining why older white guy is the one teaching Introduction to Africana Studies. There are some ways in which we can help people feel more welcome, short-term and long-term. Short-term is be proactive on a one-to-one basis. So when you see someone who is new, be they a first-year student or a new faculty or new staff, do the same thing you would do with everyone else. Introduce yourself, say hello, get to know them. And if they're a person of color, it really shouldn't make any difference. That's a very small step, but it's an important one. Second, be careful about how you communicate and avoid, ask questions, but don't ask questions that then single people out based on racial profile or anything else. We are all guilty of this sort of thing sooner or later. It's not if, but when. But we have to try. We have to try to communicate. Continuing to reach out. Don't wait for students to come to you. Go to them. Particularly if you see them struggling in a class, or you see them maybe looking like maybe they could use just a little talk, a little pep talk, something like that. I think that's one level. The second level really, I think, gets to deeper issues when it comes to the investment in increasing the diversity of our faculty and staff, in particular our faculty. And that's a tough one, particularly in these days where we're under such a budget crisis. But I continue to use the sports analogy. And Vicky, the musical theater program is another very good example of that. It's a combination of having a good reputation, but also being proactive and going out to find, persuade, recruit, and bring to campus those people that you know you need to then create that welcoming atmosphere and that educational atmosphere that you want all students to experience. We have made some progress at BW. We have a long way to go. And that would be my response to that. Okay, VO. With implicit bias as entrenched as systemic bias, how much hope can there really be to ever get over racism in the short term? I think the hope, this goes back to my earlier answer, the hope starts with each one of us who decide to commit to not being biased, to figuring out where our implicit biases are and try to correct them. I'll share a story of one of the many times where I have made a mistake. Actually, it's two stories, very quick, both involving the same problem that I sometimes have. I had a black student in class the first day, and I asked students to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about who they are, etc. And this student proceeded to give a name that was clearly an African name. It was long, and I couldn't really pronounce it very well. And so I jokingly said, "Oh, so you're Irish?" And he said, "Yes." And I thought he was joking with me. Well, it turns out that this young man was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, to parents who had emigrated from Nigeria to Ireland. And so he was as Irish as I am American. And I'll tell you, the coda to that story is that I never saw him again. So I think all of us can look into our own histories, our own pasts, and see at least moments like that where we've made that kind of mistake. My other story was of a student who, I believe her name was Alicia, and I was asking about the name, African-American female student. And I was asking about the name because I had several students that year with versions of the name Alicia. Well, she took my questioning to mean that I was asking as if it were a strange name or an African-American name, and she took offense, and I could see in her face that she did. So I encouraged her to come see me. We talked about it after class. She came a few days later to my office, and I finally got her to say, yeah, I was offended by the way that you treated me. And so I apologized. I explained why I had asked the questions, and I said, you're right, it was terrible of me to do that. I should have been more sensitive. So then I asked her what she really was interested in doing, because at the time I was working on some independent projects with Jack Winget, theater work, and she said, well, I'd really like to work on something involving at-risk youth, and particularly juveniles, black juveniles who get caught up in the juvenile justice system. I had done that work for 5 years. We talked about it. She became one of the founding members of a faculty-student collaborative with Jack that researched and then wrote a script about at-risk youth that they then performed. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago. So I was able to turn it around, but please know, particularly those of us that are white, you have to be willing to take those risks. But when you do, know that there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be errors, and those are the moments when you have to be sensitive to, okay, did I screw up? And if I did, don't run away from it. Encounter it. Have that conversation. Because it's the only way that we're going to learn what those biases are and get over them. Great question. Let's see, we've got a few more. I'll try to get to Claudia. Well, Daniel, I'm sorry. Intersectionality, how do we deal with it when it comes to issues of systemic discrimination, wealth disparity, and other political issues? I think it's, again, it goes back to what are the fundamentals. In this case, the fundamentals are where we see systemic discrimination, we have to speak up at whatever institution we're a part of. Where we see wealth disparity, the ways that we fix that are to challenge in the finance industry where we see any practices of redlining still happening, and they still do. In your own town, look at the zoning codes, look at the neighborhoods in your town. Where do you see differences? Do you see differences in groups of people based on race or ethnicity who are concentrated in one neighborhood or another? And just start asking why. Look at who's represented on city council. Lakewood prides itself on being a diverse community, but our city council is all white. We have 2 women, and they consider that, and we have people who call themselves progressive, but we have people who are of Middle East descent, we have African Americans, we have a variety of other groups who have never been represented on that city council. And so in my town, I would be asking those kinds of questions. Claudia, and I didn't get at your full question, Daniel, but I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Do you think erasing our history will help make things better today, or will it help us learn to make things better today? Our history is with us whether we like it or not, Claudia. I don't think it can be erased. I think the debate that we're having about symbols of our history, particularly, for instance, the statues to the Confederate generals that we're raising questions about taking down, this is a debate that we need to have. Certainly the symbolism of those kinds of statues that were put up to reinforce segregation and the dominance of whites, that needs to change, whether it's by putting a plaque up next to a statue or taking the statue down or putting it in a museum. I think those are the kinds of questions that communities have to answer. And it really is, I think, a community issue. There's an effort by the Justice Equity Project, I hope I got the name of it right, Brian Stevenson's group, that is currently trying to raise the awareness of the widespread practice of lynching. And they have a center that has this very powerful symbol. It's plaques with the names and the counties where people were lynched. There are thousands of them, and they're hanging from the ceiling at different heights. What he's trying to do, and his group is trying to do, is to get those counties to set up memorials in that same way to each and every person that they have documented, that over 4,700 people, 3,600 of whom were African American, across the country, to have those symbols put up. I think those are the kinds of things that we can do to embrace our history. Erasing history, quite frankly, to my view, trying to forget it, means that we literally are doomed to repeat it, because we will never reach the end point. We have seen the reemergence of these terrorist groups, the reemergence of white supremacy, the reemergence of neo-Nazis, and many other groups like it. This is a battle that never ends. This is a fight that can never be stopped. We have to ever be vigilant to protect ourselves and each other from these kinds of extremists. And at a much more moderate level, just as important, going back to the issue of implicit bias, because we're constantly changing as a country. We will be a majority-minority country of Latinos, of African Americans, of Asian Americans, etc., by 2040, in my lifetime as well as yours. That's going to raise all kinds of new tensions and problems and challenges that we have to continue to try to deal with in a constructive way and not slide backwards. Lisa Judge, voter suppression. This is a huge, huge issue because of the COVID crisis and the likelihood that we'll be relying in many states on vote by mail. We've already heard President Trump say that he doesn't think that, he thinks that there will be all kinds of fraud. He's trying to discredit it. There are states that are putting restrictions on who's eligible. Texas, you have to be 65 and over to be able to get an absentee ballot. Many states require that it be received by Election Day from a postal service that has gone broke and has delays because of its own issues with staffing because of the COVID crisis. We saw these problems in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and I suspect we may see this again in the November election. So please pay attention to what's happening in Ohio and other states. We allow vote by mail, but it's a cumbersome process. You have to send for an application, get the application, fill it out, send back. You can get it from online, and then get your absentee ballot and send that in. Many people are used to showing up on Election Day and voting. There won't be as many polling places. So I think the biggest thing that we can do individually is to vote early and encourage others to vote early. And by that, I mean like 2 to 3 weeks before the election, to make sure your ballot is received as a mailed ballot. All right, moving down. Thank you, Sarah, for those definitions. I appreciate it. All right.
This is Christy. I wonder if in the resources that we will be posting along with this recording, if you could direct folks to some resources related to local politics. I just know you have a lot of experience in Cleveland, both from your time working with nonprofits to all the work that you do now. And we hear more and more about the importance of local politics, especially related to issues such as these that you've discussed today. So I know we're kind of at the end of our hour, but I just wonder if there may be some resources you could share.
Sure.
Explore.
Absolutely. Two right off the bat. One, the Northeast Ohio Voter Action, NOVA, is a group that's been doing a lot with voter registration. I would strongly recommend looking for them. If you just type in NOVA to website, you should find their website. They've been very active in registering voters. The League of Women Voters certainly has been very active in that as well. If there are issues of voter suppression or suspicions of this, you can certainly file a complaint with the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections or your own county's Board of Elections. You can also file a complaint with the ACLU of Ohio. We're very fortunate that their main office is near the campus of Cleveland State, right downtown. So related to issues of voting, I would strongly recommend that. Going to your County Board of Elections website will tell if you're actively registered. Keep in mind that if you have not voted in the last, I believe it's 3 election cycles, you may have had your registration purged. This is a law in Ohio that was upheld by the courts. So be sure, if you haven't voted in a while, to check your registration to make sure that it's current. You can register to vote up to 30 days before the day of the election. So that's going to be roughly that last week of October. So I would recommend that. Also, I'll just point out at the end of this slide, I do have references. These are all websites that I pulled information from for the presentation. And then I have 2 other slides. One is recommended reading. Now, if I had a full list, it would be a slideshow of 20 or 30 slides. But these are just highlights that I've read that I find very powerful, ranging from James Baldwin to Ta-Nehisi Coates, Rothstein that I mentioned. These are really excellent works that you should consider. And then Black media. These are several media sites, and very interesting, I'll note. And again, this is all, some of this is has been going on for a while, but on FM radio, some of you who, like me, might have been alternative rock fans and listened to 99.1, you may have noticed that their format has changed. They are now the Black Information Network, a 24/7 news station devoted to Black perspective on news, current events, entertainment, etc. I have never seen anything like this in my lifetime that I'm aware of. Not that I am a media expert, but I would suggest tuning in. And this is from iHeartRadio, which is, of course, the big conglomerate, so be suspicious. It's a big corporation. However, for what it's worth, you might want to check that out. Not music. You still have to go to 107.9 or WZAK or one of the other stations if you're looking for music. So that's that. Does that help?
Tom, this is Julie. We're out of time. I think there may have been one more question. Would you be able to respond to that perhaps by email, or do you want to take that question now? I have
let's see. Is this the one from Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, let me read it real quick. The terminology, historically considered quadroon, what it would have been used to define someone like me between the time it would stop being used and when selected multiple choices was allowed. Did the census still subscribe to hypodescent throughout the 20th century, or did they opt for some other methodology? I'll respond in a longer email, but in short, the differentiation of types of African American, because remember the one drop rule, which was in existence for a long time, where any possibility that you had black blood made you black, no matter what it was. That's where these quadroon, octoroon terms come from. That was, I believe, dropped by as you said, it was dropped in 1900, and it just went to, the term was Negro at the time, and then eventually became African American and black. And of course now, as I mentioned, since 2000, people can now check multiple race boxes, which is likely a much more accurate, particularly the new interesting technology that we're dealing with is Ancestry.com and 23andMe. So we have more and more people who are looking up their genetic ancestry, and then they turn around and that becomes part of what they use to check those boxes on the census form. But Sarah, I'll check more and I'll respond to you also by email in more detail in the next day or two.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sutton, for presenting this evening, and for everyone for attending. We really appreciate that this became interactive. There were lots of great questions, and we hope that will continue throughout this series. Again, as Christy mentioned earlier, this is an ongoing conversation. So please let us know if you have ideas or a story you would like to share, something that you would want the VW community to engage in. We hope you'll join us next week as we continue this series. We actually have 2 presentations next week. On Wednesday from 4 to 5. It's entitled From the Ivory Tower to the Trenches, Raising Children in a Culture of Racism. And then on Thursday from 1 to 2, religion and racial justice. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone, for being part of this.
Thanks, Tom.